Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat, and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments, do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The sun burned low across the Arizona desert, staining the horizon in blood and gold. Wind carried dust and the scent of mesquite through the stillness of a canyon where nothing but the cries of hawks broke the silence. It was a land of endless horizon, the kind that swallowed men whole and buried their names beneath sand and bone. Near the edge of a dried riverbed, a small band of bounty hunters rode with hard eyes and cruel grins. They were men used to taking what they wanted. Coin, whiskey, or women. Tied across the back of one horse was a figure wrapped in rough hemp rope, her dark hair tangled, her skin smeared with blood and dust. She was an Apache woman, proud, silent, and fierce-eyed despite her condition. Her captors had found her wandering the foothills after a skirmish between settlers and her people. They saw her not as a human being but as a trophy, something that could fetch coin or pleasure. The leader of the group, a scar-faced outlaw named Briggs, spat into the sand and declared that she'd be taught her place before sunrise. But fate, in the Wild West, has a strange way of twisting the cruel intentions of men. As they approached a lone oak standing apart from the barren land, a rare, gnarled survivor known to locals as the Cowboy's tree, Briggs halted his horse. Beneath its crooked limbs, the soil was littered with old ropes and broken bones. It was said to be the place where outlaws were once hanged, and sometimes where justice was taken into men's own hands. "Tie her up," Briggs ordered. His men obeyed, binding the Apache woman's wrists above her head to one of the thick, low branches. The rough rope bit into her skin, drawing thin lines of red across her wrists. She didn't cry out. She only glared, her breath steady, her spirit unbroken. Briggs stepped back to admire his cruelty. "We'll rest here tonight," he said, "and in the morning maybe she'll tell us where the rest of her tribe's hiding their gold." The men laughed, lighting a small fire as the night settled cold around them. Coyotes howled in the distance. The Apache woman closed her eyes and whispered something under her breath, a prayer perhaps, or a curse. Hours passed. The fire dimmed to embers, the laughter faded into snores. And that was when another sound entered the night, the quiet tread of boots and the metallic jingle of spurs. From the darkness, a lone rider appeared. His horse moved like a shadow, its hooves barely stirring the dust. The man in the saddle wore a wide-brimmed hat, a long coat, and a bandana covering half his face. His revolver gleamed in the moonlight, but he did not draw it. He simply watched, a ghostly figure at the edge of the dying firelight. The woman opened her eyes and froze. She didn't know who he was, but something about his stillness, the controlled way he breathed, told her he was not like the others. The mysterious cowboy dismounted, his boots silent as he approached the tree. His eyes met hers for a brief, heavy moment. Then, without a word, he drew his knife. The blade flashed, slicing through the ropes that held her. She stumbled forward, her body weak, but before she could fall, he caught her. Strong hands beneath her arms, steady as stone. She expected violence. Instead, he eased her down gently against the trunk of the tree. From the campfire's glow, Briggs stirred, sensing movement. His eyes snapped open. "Who the hell?" He didn't finish the sentence. A single gunshot cracked the night open like thunder. The cowboy's revolver smoked in the moonlight. Briggs slumped to the ground before he could reach for his gun. The rest of the outlaws scrambled in panic, but the stranger moved faster than lightning, each shot deliberate, merciless, and quiet. When it was over, the desert was silent again, save for the wind brushing through the tree's leaves. The Apache woman watched him, wide-eyed, her chest heaving. She didn't understand why he had saved her. Men like him, cowboys, settlers, bounty hunters, had only ever brought pain to her people. He said nothing. Instead, he knelt beside her, pulling a canteen from his saddlebag. He offered it to her, and though she hesitated, thirst won over fear. The cool water touched her cracked lips, and she drank like someone who had been dying. When she handed it back, he nodded once, then looked toward the horizon. Dawn was coming soon, and with it, trouble. He motioned to his horse and pointed toward the distant hills, a silent invitation for her to leave while she still could, but her legs wouldn't move. She had nowhere to go. Her village was gone, her people scattered or dead. The cowboy seemed to understand. He looked down at the dirt, his jaw tightening. Then, for the first time he spoke, his voice low, almost gravelly. "You're safe now. Rest." And without another word he walked away, disappearing into the misty pre-dawn light. The Apache woman leaned against the cowboy's tree, the memory of his steady hands haunting her. She didn't know his name, but something told her that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Because in the Wild West, fate was as cruel and beautiful as the desert itself, and sometimes the tree that once brought death could become the place where redemption began. The morning sun rose cold and red over the desert, spilling across the sand like a wound reopening. The wind had shifted, bringing with it the dry scent of smoke and blood. Beneath the gnarled branches of the cowboy's tree, the aftermath of the night's violence lay still, silent bodies, broken rope, and footprints leading toward the horizon. The Apache woman stirred weakly. Her wrists were raw where the rope had bitten through, and her body ached from exhaustion. For a moment she believed it had all been a dream. The mysterious cowboy, the sudden gunfire, her release from the tree. But as she opened her eyes, she saw the prints in the sand where his boots had been. They led east, toward the canyons. He had left her alive. For a long while, she sat there, unsure of what to do. Her tribe was gone, her captors dead, and the land around her was nothing but endless emptiness. The fire that had once burned fiercely in her heart, the pride of her people, the will to fight, was flickering low, yet something in her would not let her stay. Something told her that her story was not meant to end beneath that cursed tree. She rose, her body trembling, and began to follow the tracks. The desert was cruel. By midday, the sun baked the ground into a shimmering mirage. Her lips cracked, her throat burned, and her vision blurred. But she kept walking, one slow step at a time. The cowboy's trail wound through a dry arroyo and up into the foothills, where the air grew cooler and the scent of pine replaced the dust. She found him there, hours later, kneeling beside a small stream. His horse stood nearby, drinking quietly. The man himself moved with the calm, deliberate manner of someone who had lived too long with danger. He didn't startle when she approached. He only looked up, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. There were no words between them. He simply turned back to the stream, filling his canteen, while she stood uncertain, unsure if she was welcome. Yet, he didn't drive her away. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a strip of dried jerky, and set it on a flat rock between them. Then he walked a few paces away and sat down. For the first time in days she ate. As the sun dipped below the ridges, the cowboy built a small fire. He seemed to know the land intimately, how to use the wind, where to find shelter, how to keep the flames hidden from wandering eyes. She watched him work, curious but cautious. Every movement spoke of discipline and quiet strength, but behind it all was something else, a weariness she couldn't name. When the night grew cold, he pulled a blanket from his saddle and placed it near her without meeting her eyes. She hesitated, still half expecting violence, but none came. Instead, he sat a few feet away, gazing into the fire as if haunted by ghosts only he could see. The Apache woman tried to sleep, but dreams came, dark and full of screams. She saw her village burning again, her people scattering into the night, her father's voice fading beneath gunfire. When she woke, the stars had shifted, and the cowboy was still awake, his revolver resting across his knees. He wasn't watching her. He was listening, to the night, to the distant cries of coyotes, to something deeper. By morning, the air carried a different sound, the faint thunder of horses far away, riders. The cowboy stiffened. Without a word, he kicked dirt over the fire, packed his gear, and motioned for her to follow. She didn't question it. The fear in his movements was enough. They climbed higher into the hills, taking narrow trails that wound through pines and stone. Below them, a group of armed men rode hard across the valley floor, bounty hunters, searching for the ones who had killed Briggs and his gang. The cowboy watched them pass, his jaw tight. It was clear now that saving her had cost him more than bullets. There was a price on his head, or soon would be. As they traveled, the Apache woman began to notice the small things about him. the way his left hand trembled when he reloaded his gun, the faint scar along his collarbone, the old burn mark on the back of his neck, half hidden beneath his hair. These were the marks of a man who had lived through hell and walked away. That night, when they finally rested near a canyon wall, she noticed something else. Something carved into the stone above their camp, a name, faded but still visible, Elias Grant. It meant nothing to her, but from the way he paused and looked at the carving, it meant everything to him. As he set up camp, she watched him again. He never looked at her with hunger, never treated her like property. Instead, there was a quiet respect, an unspoken recognition of shared pain, and slowly her fear began to fade into curiosity. Why had he saved her? What debt did he owe to a stranger tied to a tree? The answer would come days later, but not before the desert tested them again. At dawn they woke to the sound of gunfire echoing through the hills. The bounty hunters had found their trail. The cowboy's horse reared, startled, and he cursed under his breath as bullets struck the rocks around them. The Apache woman ducked behind a boulder, heart pounding. She had no weapon, no defense, only her will to survive. Elias, she could now think of him by that name, fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. Each shot he fired was precise, patient. 2 of the pursuers fell before the rest retreated into the valley. But it was enough to force them to keep moving, deeper into the wild, away from any trace of civilization. When the silence returned, the woman saw the blood, a crimson stain spreading across his side. He'd been hit. He stumbled but said nothing, refusing to slow. She ran to his side, tearing a strip from her dress to press against the wound. For the first time, he didn't resist her touch. He only met her eyes briefly, silent gratitude, and kept walking. They reached a shallow cave by nightfall. There, she cleaned the wound with trembling hands, remembering her mother's herbs, her grandmother's words. It wasn't much, but it might keep him alive. As he drifted into uneasy sleep, she sat beside the fire, watching his face in the dim light. Beneath the hardened lines and stubble, he looked younger. Broken, yes, but human. She realized then that they were bound not by fate, but by survival. 2 souls abandoned by the world, clinging to whatever fragments of hope still remained. Outside, the wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the echoes of distant hoofbeats. The hunters weren't gone. They would return. And when they did, blood would fall on this land again. The Apache woman looked out into the dark, her hand tightening around the old knife she had taken from one of the dead men. This time, she would not run. Night draped its black cloak over the desert once more. The wind carried a mournful whistle through the canyon walls, echoing like the cries of ghosts long forgotten. Beneath a shallow rock ledge, the Apache woman tended to the wounded cowboy, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that clawed at her bones. The fire flickered low, painting their shadows against the stone, 2 broken silhouettes clinging to the edge of survival. Elias Grant, the name carved into the canyon wall, slept fitfully. His breath came shallow and rough. Each rise of his chest was a battle against pain. The bullet had passed clean through his side, but blood loss had drained his strength. The Apache woman, though weary, refused to let him die. Not after what he had done for her beneath the cowboy's tree. She tore strips from her own dress, soaked them in water from her flask, and pressed them against the wound. The fabric darkened with blood, but her eyes stayed focused, her movements sure. She whispered words from her mother's tongue, prayers to the spirits of earth and wind, to the ancestors who guarded those who walked between life and death. The flames crackled softly, answering her like a heartbeat. Outside, the coyotes sang their nightly hymn. The stars glimmered faintly, half-veiled by drifting clouds. The land was vast and empty, but she could feel something watching from the darkness beyond the rocks. Perhaps it was only fear, or perhaps it was the eyes of men, hunting in the night by dawn. Elias stirred, his body trembled as fever took hold, and the Apache woman used a handful of desert herbs she found nearby to ease his pain. She crushed them between 2 stones, mixed the powder with water, and pressed it to his lips. He drank, unconscious, his breathing slowing into a steady rhythm. As the light crept into the canyon, she stepped outside and scanned the valley. The tracks of horses scarred the sand below, fresh, heading north. The bounty hunters were searching still. They wouldn't stop until they found whoever had slaughtered Briggs and his men, and if they found her with the cowboy, they'd hang them both. The Apache woman returned to the cave, her heart heavy. She had lost her people to violence, and now, beside this wounded stranger, she was bound to it again. Yet this time, something was different. This wasn't just survival, it was something deeper, something she couldn't name. Hours passed. Elias woke fully by midday, his face pale but his eyes clear. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The silent understanding between them was enough. He watched her move about the small camp, saw the way she blended with the desert, strong, efficient, unyielding. She was no victim, no fragile spirit. She was carved from the same stone as the land itself. In the stillness of that canyon, two outcasts began to share the fragile thread of trust. As the day waned, Elias forced himself to stand. Pain rippled through his side, but he refused to show it. He gathered what little gear he had and checked his revolver. The Apache woman watched quietly. She knew that look in his eyes, the kind that belonged to men who never stayed in one place long enough to be caught. But before he could leave, she handed him a small pouch of herbs and pointed to his wound. He hesitated, then accepted it with a slow nod. No words passed, yet gratitude filled the space between them like the warmth of fire in a cold cave. They left the canyon together as twilight descended, heading toward the high ridges. The landscape unfolded before them. Vast plains, ridged cliffs, and the fading remnants of an old trail once used by traders. Every step took them deeper into the wild, farther from law, farther from the world that had wronged them both. But the past is never left behind so easily. That night they reached an abandoned mining camp tucked between jagged rocks. The place was silent, its wooden shacks rotting under the weight of time. Broken tools lay scattered across the dust, and a collapsed mine shaft gaped open like a wound in the earth. Elias made a small fire inside one of the shacks, while the woman scouted the area. Her senses were sharp, every sound, every shadow. She had been raised to read the land like a book, and tonight it told her something was coming. Far in the distance, a single column of smoke rose against the darkening sky. The hunters were close. She returned to the shack and found Elias seated by the firelight, staring at a small, worn photograph in his hand. The image was faded, but she could make out a woman and a child, faces blurred by time, eyes that once held light. Elias's hand trembled as he folded it away. He wasn't just a drifter. He was a man haunted by ghosts. The Apache woman didn't know his story, but she could feel the weight of it, the same way she felt the loss of her tribe. Their laughter swallowed by gunfire, their memories carried in the wind. That night the storm finally broke. Rain lashed the desert, washing dust into rivers of red clay. Thunder rolled across the plains like cannon fire. Inside the shack the roof leaked, the walls creaked, but they stayed close to the small flame between them. The smell of wet wood and iron filled the air. Elias's wound reopened in the cold. The Apache woman worked through the night, binding it again, her fingers trembling with fatigue. He tried to push her away, but she refused. This time, she would not lose another soul to death. When she was done, she sat by the doorway, her knife resting on her knee, listening to the rain. As dawn broke, the rain ceased. The world smelled of wet sage and smoke. But their peace was short-lived. A sound echoed from beyond the ridge, the sharp, hollow crack of gunfire. Elias stiffened instantly. The hunters had found their trail. They barely had time to gather their things. Horses appeared on the rise. 5, maybe 6 riders, armed and ruthless. The bounty on Elias's head had drawn them like wolves to blood. The first shot shattered the quiet, splintering wood beside the doorway. The Apache woman dragged Elias out the back, down toward the old mine shaft. They slipped into the darkness, just as bullets tore through the shack behind them. The tunnel reeked of damp earth and old death. Wooden beams groaned overhead, threatening collapse with every step. Elias leaned heavily against the wall, his breath ragged. The Apache woman took his revolver, gripping it in both hands, her heart pounding. For years she had lived by the knife and the bow, not the gun. But tonight it would have to do. The bounty hunters entered the shaft one by one, their lanterns flickering through the dark. Shadows danced across the walls. The Apache woman crouched low, steadying her aim. When the first man appeared, she fired once. The shot echoed like thunder, and his lantern crashed to the ground, plunging them into blackness. Chaos erupted. The cave shuddered as more bullets tore through the rock. Dust filled the air. Elias, weakened but alive, reached for her arm, guiding her toward a narrow crevice at the back. Together, they pushed through the darkness until the tunnel split into two. Behind them, the ceiling gave way with a deafening roar. When the dust settled, silence returned. Only the faint drip of water echoed through the ruin. They were alive, but trapped, deep beneath the earth, with only the faint light of dawn seeping through a crack above. The Apache woman turned to Elias. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes were steady. The look they shared then was wordless, powerful. Two lives bound by chance, now buried together under the same sky they had tried to escape. Above, the storm clouds began to break apart, revealing the first golden rays of morning. But in that broken mine, survival had only just begun. The earth had swallowed them whole. Dust filled the air like smoke, choking every breath, settling on their skin and in their hair. The silence that followed, the collapse, was suffocating. A silence so thick it pressed against the chest, as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. The Apache woman knelt beside the fallen cowboy, her lungs burning as she tried to listen for the sound of his breathing. It came faintly, shallow but steady. He was alive. Around them, the dim shaft was caved in, the world reduced to shadow and rubble. The last lantern had been crushed in the fall, leaving only a slit of light seeping from a narrow crack in the rock above. It painted the walls in a ghostly glow, catching on the dust that drifted like snow. The Apache woman coughed, pressing a hand to her face. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of rot and forgotten things. This mine had been abandoned for years. She could see it in the blackened timbers, the rusted tools half buried in the dirt. Somewhere deep within, water dripped in slow, rhythmic beats. Elias lay motionless beside her, his body weak from the wound and the fall. She checked his side. The bleeding had started again, the bandage soaked dark. There was no time to think, only to act. She tore another strip from her torn dress, pressing it hard against the wound, whispering words to the spirits that had guided her ancestors through death and drought. As she worked, her eyes caught something glinting in the dust, the faint shimmer of metal. She brushed it aside and uncovered a small silver locket, tarnished but still whole. The engraving was faint, but she could make out initials, e.g. it was his. When she opened it, the faces of a woman and a young boy stared back at her, frozen in time. The child's smile was bright, innocent. The woman's eyes carried warmth and sorrow all at once. The Apache woman closed it gently and tucked it back into his coat. She didn't need to know the story. She could feel it. He had lost them, long ago. Hours passed. The air grew colder. Elias stirred only once, his hand twitching weakly before falling still again. She forced herself to move, searching for another way out. The tunnel ahead was narrow and half collapsed, but she could feel faint air on her face when she leaned toward it. That meant, somewhere, somehow, there was an opening. She began to dig with her bare hands. The earth was damp and heavy, the stones sharp enough to tear her palms, but she kept going, clawing at the dirt until her fingers bled. Every handful of soil she moved felt like defiance against death itself. Above, the storm still rumbled faintly, a reminder that the world beyond still turned, uncaring of those trapped beneath it. She worked until her body could no longer obey. Exhausted, she slumped beside him, listening to the slow rhythm of his breath. Sleep crept upon her like a shadow. In her dreams, she saw her people again, the smoke rising from their lodges, the laughter of children near the river, her father standing tall beside the fire. But when she reached out, the images crumbled into ash. Only one remained. The face of the cowboy, half hidden beneath his hat, the same man who had cut her down from the tree and given her life when others sought to take it. When she woke, hours or maybe days had passed. Her body ached. Her throat was dry as bone, but something had changed. The faint crack in the wall had widened, a new tremor perhaps, or the shifting of earth. She could see light now, clearer than before. Hope, fragile but real, stirred in her chest. She turned back to Elias. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, but his chest still rose and fell. She found his canteen, half empty, and poured what little water remained over his lips. He swallowed weakly, the first sign of strength she had seen in days. With renewed resolve, She gathered the broken pieces of wood from the fallen beams and wedged one beneath the crack. The rock shifted slightly, dust cascading from above. Again she pressed, forcing her shoulder against it, her muscles screaming with pain. The crack widened. A gust of cold, clean air rushed through, scattering the dust. She gasped. Freedom was on the other side. Summoning the last of her strength, she cleared the rubble until the hole was wide enough to crawl through. She turned back to Elias, gripping his arm. His body was heavy, unresponsive, but she refused to leave him behind. Inch by inch, she dragged him toward the light, her body trembling with each pull. It took hours, maybe more. The sun had risen by the time she emerged, the desert painted in gold and red once again. She pulled him into the open air, collapsing beside him. The wind brushed her face, cool and alive. For the first time since that night beneath the cowboy's tree, she felt the weight of the earth lift from her chest. They had escaped death again, but the desert was not merciful. Far in the distance, she saw the faint movement of riders. The bounty hunters had returned, scouring the land like vultures. They would not stop, not until Elias Grant was dead. She dragged him beneath a cluster of rocks, shading him from the sun. He was breathing, but barely. His fever had returned, and his wound had turned dark around the edges. Without herbs, without shelter, he wouldn't last another day. She knew what she had to do. Leaving him hidden, she rose and began walking toward the distant hills. Somewhere out there, she had seen the thin line of smoke earlier. A settlement, perhaps, or a camp. If she could reach it before nightfall, she might find help. The desert stretched endless before her. Her feet bled, her skin burned, but she didn't stop. Not once. By dusk she found it. A small ranch, half abandoned, its fences broken, its well dry. But someone had been there recently. The scent of gun oil and horses lingered in the air. She slipped through the empty stable, searching. Inside, she found what she needed: a sack of dried provisions, a flask of water, a bundle of clean cloth. She gathered them quickly, but before she could leave, the sound of boots echoed behind her. The bounty hunters. She froze, her heart hammering. Shadows moved across the doorway. Voices muttered low, sharp, familiar. They were closing in. The Apache woman pressed herself against the wall, gripping the small knife she still carried. Her breath was shallow. Her eyes darted toward the open window, her only way out. But as she prepared to move, her gaze caught something hanging on the far wall. A wanted poster, nailed to the wood. The face was Elias Grant's. The reward was heavy, enough to buy a man's freedom or a town's silence. And beneath it, in faded ink, were the words, "Wanted for the murder of a U.S. Marshal, and the disappearance of his wife and child." The knife trembled in her hand. The photograph in the locket flashed in her mind. The woman and the boy, the sorrow in his eyes, the story he had never told. Before she could think, the door creaked open. Boots stepped inside. The Apache woman slipped silently through the window, vanishing into the night, clutching the supplies tight to her chest. Behind her, the voices grew louder, the hunt resuming once more. And in the cold desert darkness, she knew the truth was coming for both of them, not just from the men who hunted them, but from the ghosts that lived inside his heart. The desert had no mercy, only memory. By the time the Apache woman returned to the rocky hollow where she had hidden Elias, the sun was sinking low, its dying light painting the canyon in shades of red and rust. Her steps were heavy, her body worn thin by exhaustion, but her resolve remained unbroken. In her arms she carried the supplies she had risked everything to find: water, bandages, food, and hope. When she reached him, he was still alive, though barely. His breath rasped like wind through dry grass, his skin slick with fever. She poured water between his cracked lips, wiped his brow with a cool cloth, and pressed herbs against the darkened wound. The smell of infection filled the air, sharp and earthy. All through the night she worked in silence, feeding the fire with bits of dry brush, keeping him warm, willing his heart to keep beating in the moments between tending him. Her eyes would drift to the locket she had found, the one that held the faces of the woman and the child. The words from the wanted poster echoed in her mind: murder, Marshal, wife, and child. She had seen killers before. She had seen liars and men who hid their violence behind gentle words, But Elias Grant did not fit those men. He had risked his life to save hers, when he could have ridden away and never looked back. Still, the truth was buried somewhere beneath his silence, and the desert would not rest until it was unearthed. When dawn came, the light crept slowly across his face. He stirred weakly, his eyes opening to the brightness. The Apache woman sat near the fire, her knife across her knees, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. She handed him the canteen, and watched as he drank, the tension between them heavy and wordless. She wanted to ask him what he had done, what had brought a bounty so large upon his head. But she didn't need to ask. The truth began to unravel on its own. As the day passed and the fever broke, fragments of memory returned to Elias. In the haze of pain and exhaustion, he saw it again. The smoke rising over a quiet homestead, the screaming of horses, the smell of blood and gunpowder. He remembered his wife's voice, soft as the wind through wheat fields, and the small hand of his son clutching his as they ran. Then came the gunfire, the faces of the men who took everything, the badge of a marshal gleaming in the sun. He had been framed. Once Elias Grant had worn that same badge. He had been a lawman, a good one, but in a land where justice was as dry as the desert, good men were easily buried under lies. His partner, a marshal hungry for power and gold, had turned on him. When Elias uncovered his corruption, the marshal had struck first, murdering Elias's family and blaming him for it. The law turned against him, the bounty was set, and Elias vanished into the wild, becoming the ghost of a man he once was. He had carried the locket ever since, not as a token of love, but as a reminder of his failure. The Apache woman did not know these details, but she saw it in his eyes when he finally looked at her, that haunted stare of a man who had already walked through fire. In her heart something shifted, not pity but understanding. They were both survivors of loss, both exiles from the worlds that had betrayed them. For days they stayed hidden in that hollow, nursing his strength back. The bounty hunters still searched the plains, their campfires glowing like stars in the distance each night. She kept watch while he rested, listening to the wind carry their voices, waiting for the right time to move. On the fourth night, the desert gave them a gift, a storm. It rolled in from the west, black and furious, thunder rumbling across the open sky. Rain fell like silver knives, washing the sand clean and drowning all tracks. It was the cover they needed. Elias rose from the firelight, weak but determined. The Apache woman helped him onto his horse, and together they rode through the downpour, the lightning flashing across the desert like the anger of the gods. The wind tore at their clothes and the rain stung their faces, but neither looked back. They rode until the storm passed and the world fell silent again. The smell of wet earth filled the air, and the stars shone sharp through the clearing clouds. They reached the base of an old plateau, a place where the land rose high and jagged. There, hidden among the rocks, they found a narrow cave overlooking the valley. It would serve as their refuge until dawn. Inside, Elias built a small fire while the woman stood at the cave's mouth, scanning the horizon. Her instincts told her danger was close, even before she saw the faint orange glow of torches in the distance. The hunters were still on their trail. She turned to Elias, her eyes hard but calm. This man, this broken, hunted soul, had once saved her life beneath the cowboy's tree. Now it was her turn to stand between him and the men who sought his blood. They waited in silence, the sound of hoofbeats drawing closer. Elias checked his revolver, spinning the cylinder once, his face grim. The Apache woman gripped her knife, feeling the pulse of her heartbeat echo through the stone walls. The riders reached the valley below, their torches flickering like stars in the dark. Voices carried faintly through the wind, harsh, angry, eager for gold. They fanned out, searching, unaware that their quarry was watching from above. Hours passed, the fire burned low. The hunters began to circle the base of the plateau, and Elias knew it was only a matter of time before they found the trail. He turned toward the woman, and for the first time, there was something unguarded in his gaze. It wasn't fear, it was acceptance. He knew he could not outrun them forever. The desert was wide, but guilt traveled faster than any horse. His past was a wound that would never close, no matter how far he rode. The Apache woman saw that in his face, and something fierce sparked within her. She would not let the man who had saved her hang for crimes he did not commit. Not while she still drew breath. Before dawn, she left the cave and descended into the valley. Her footsteps were silent, her presence ghost-like. She moved through the shadows toward the camp of the bounty hunters. There were 6 of them, maybe 7, all sleeping around the dying embers of a fire. Their horses stood tethered nearby, restless. She crept closer, her knife flashing briefly in the moonlight. One by one, she cut the reins, slapping the horses hard. They bolted into the darkness, their thundering hooves sending panic through the camp. The men woke shouting, stumbling to their feet as chaos erupted. From the ridge above, Elias watched it unfold, realization dawning too late. She was buying him time, risking herself again. Gunfire tore through the night. Sparks flew. Her silhouette vanished into the smoke. And when the first light of morning touched the desert, the camp below was in ruins. Bodies lay scattered among the ashes. Of the Apache woman there was no sign, only her knife, buried deep in the sand. Elias descended slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He searched through the wreckage, calling her name into the silence. There was no answer, only the whisper of wind over the dunes. She was gone, taken by the storm, the earth, or the ghosts that ruled this cruel land. He fell to his knees, clutching her knife, the memory of her strength burning in his chest like the last ember of a dying fire. The sun rose over the horizon, and with it came a new resolve. The man who had once fled from his past would run no more. He would find her, or die trying. The desert morning was pale and cold, the kind of silence that carried the weight of endings. The air smelled of smoke and death, and the sand was still scarred by the struggle of the night before. Elias Grant stood alone among the remnants of the battle. The dead bounty hunters sprawled in the dirt, the ashes of their fire drifting on the wind, and the knife she had left behind. He turned the blade over in his hands, feeling the worn leather of its hilt. It was small, yet it held the weight of everything he owed her, his life, his redemption, and perhaps something deeper that neither of them had dared name. The Apache woman had vanished into the dawn, leaving behind nothing but questions and the echo of her courage. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the desolation. Elias saddled his horse with slow, deliberate movements. The fever had left him weak, his wounds still raw, but his resolve was unshakable. He would not let her story end here, in a nameless canyon among corpses and dust. He followed the trail she might have taken, the faint impressions of bare feet in the sand, a broken branch here, a drop of blood there. The tracks led north, toward the high mesas and the old trails of her people. He rode through the day, the horizon shimmering with heat, the silence pressing down like a weight. As he rode, memories returned in waves. The first time he had seen her tied to the cowboy's tree, her eyes defiant even in captivity. The moment he had chosen not to harm her but to free her instead. The long nights they had spent surviving side by side, mistrust giving way to an unspoken bond. She had taught him that redemption was not found in words or prayers, but in deeds. By sunset, he reached the foothills. The land rose sharply here, dotted with ancient pines and the skeletal remains of burned-out trees. Somewhere beyond lay a sacred valley once belonging to the Apache, a place where the living spoke with the spirits of their ancestors. If she was alive, she would have gone there as night fell. Elias made camp near a shallow stream. He built a small fire and sat in silence, staring into the flames. The stars stretched wide above him, vast and indifferent. He thought of the life he had lost, his wife, his child, his name. But beneath that grief, something else had taken root. The woman had given him a reason to fight again, not for revenge, but for truth. When dawn came, he mounted his horse and rode deeper into the wilderness. The trail grew steeper, winding through jagged rock and twisted trees. Birds circled overhead, their cries sharp against the still air. Then, just as the sun crested the ridge, he saw it, a small figure moving through the clearing below. It was her. The Apache woman walked slowly, her steps unsteady. She bore the marks of battle, scratches on her arms, blood crusted on her skin. But she was alive. She moved toward a familiar landmark that made Elias's heart seize, the cowboy's tree. The old tree stood alone in the center of the clearing, its gnarled limbs reaching toward the sky like pleading hands. It was the place where their story had begun, where she had been tied and left to fate, and where Elias had chosen mercy over cruelty. Now it would become the place where everything would end, or begin again. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. From a distance he saw her kneel before the tree, pressing her hands against its bark. The wind moved through her hair, and for a moment she seemed to be speaking to it, not in words but in spirit. It was as if she was giving thanks or seeking peace for the souls lost to violence. Elias stopped a few paces away, lowering his head. The tree had seen much suffering, but now it stood as a witness to something rare in the Wild West, a redemption born of compassion. He looked around the clearing. The land was quiet, untouched by men or war. It was as if time itself had paused. When she finally turned, their eyes met. There were no words spoken, only a silent understanding that everything they had endured had brought them here, to this fragile moment of peace. For the first time Elias felt the weight of his past begin to lift. The ghosts that had followed him through every dusty town and every sleepless night seemed to fade. The man he once was, a fugitive, a broken soul, was dying here beneath the shadow of the tree. In his place stood something new, something whole. He dismounted and approached the tree, his movements slow and reverent. He reached into his coat and pulled out the locket, the one he had carried for so long. The faces inside were worn, the metal tarnished. He held it for a long while before setting it at the base of the tree. The woman watched in silence, her expression unreadable. The gesture was simple, but it meant everything. It was his way of letting go, of his pain, his vengeance, his past. The cowboy's tree, once a place of punishment, had become a shrine of forgiveness. A soft wind stirred the branches, and in that whispering sound, Elias thought he could almost hear the laughter of his son, the voice of his wife, the promise of peace. The Apache woman knelt beside the locket and placed her knife beside it, the same knife she had left behind after the battle. Two symbols of survival, side by side. She rose, turning toward the horizon, and began to walk. Elias watched her go for a moment, then followed. The two figures moved together across the open land, their shadows stretching long across the sand. Behind them, the cowboy's tree stood tall against the sky, its twisted limbs catching the morning light. The desert would remember their story, the outlaw who had found mercy, and the woman who had taught him the meaning of it. In a land built on vengeance and blood, they had found something rarer than gold, redemption. As they rode north, leaving behind the valley of the dead and the whispers of the past, the sun broke fully over the horizon. The land glowed with promise, and for the first time in many years Elias Grant smiled. The Apache woman glanced at him once, her expression calm and knowing. They said nothing. They didn't have to. The wind carried their silence forward, and the road ahead stretched wide and unending. Far behind them, at the base of the cowboy's tree, the locket and the knife rested side by side. The gold caught the morning light, and the steel gleamed like a promise, and in that light, the desert finally seemed at peace.